Mothra. She's one of the most popular and recognizable cinematic monsters in the world. First introduced in the 1961 classic Mothra, she was integrated into the Godzilla franchise 3 years later in Mothra vs. Godzilla, after which she became a mainstay character, appearing in 15 Godzilla films so far, as well as starring in her own trilogy in the 90s. But did you know that Mothra doesn't technically have her roots in film? In fact, Mothra's first appearance was in literature, a novella to be precise, titled The Luminous Fairies and Mothra. This short story debuted in a weekly magazine called the Asahi Weekly Supplement in January of 1961. A collaboration between not one, not two, but 3 authors, this story was commissioned by Toho Studios with the expectation that it would become the outline for a film adaptation. This unique story, and the story of the equally unique circumstances that led to its creation, is finally available for a whole new audience to experience. The Luminous Fairies and Mothra has made its English debut, and I had the incredible opportunity to speak to the man who made it possible, Jeffrey Angles. You may already be familiar with his work, as he is the man responsible for translating the Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again novels that came out in 2023.
After these translations, Godzilla and Godzilla Raids Again, came out from University of Minnesota Press, a number of people started writing to the press saying, well, gosh, we hope that you'll do the novella on which the Mothra movie was based next. And so my editor at University of Minnesota Press wrote to me and said, hey, Jeffrey, what do you know about this book, The Luminous Fairies and Mothra? Would you be interested in doing that for us? And so, of course, I don't think I even paused for more than 10 seconds before writing back to them and saying, yes, I'd love to do that.
Fans who think they know everything there is to know about the benevolent butterfly may be surprised by some of the differences between the Luminous Fairies and Mothra and its cinematic counterpart. One of the biggest differences is with the origins of Mothra herself. While the films have always highlighted the spiritual and mythological aspects of the character to some degree, they have always been left rather generalized. The novella, however, dives much deeper into it, offering a very specific religious origin story that adds welcome layers to an already deeply thematic monster.
In the second portion of the story, the portion that was written by the writer Fukunaga Takehiko, he was a person that was really interested in mythology, for instance. And so in his portion of the story, he's embedded a creation myth of Infant Island and of Mothra. That actually ends up being dropped from the 1961 film, but that inclusion in the novella does begin to kind of inform some of the later iterations of Mothra. The story, in some ways, harkens back to the story of Adam and Eve a little bit. There's a god who then divides himself in two. One half becomes a goddess, and the other half, stays male. And through the kind of interaction of the two, the rest of the universe is formed. Unfortunately, that mythology doesn't make its way into the movie at all. They do add in another kind of mythological elements into the 1961 film. Like, for instance, there's a kind of mysterious symbol that looks like a Christian cross. The characters soon realize has some connection with Mothra. There's a different kind of quasi-religious symbolism that is introduced in the film to replace the creation story that was taken away from the novella. Apparently that happens because there was a contract between Toho Studios and Columbia Pictures to distribute the film abroad. And so I think that the Japanese film producers were trying to think about, well, how can we make this story a little bit more appealing to the Judeo-Christian audience in America and beyond? So they definitely included this thing that had this sort of Christian messianic element to it. In the film, Mothra is very much like a kind of messiah-like figure that comes along and helps the poor, downtrodden people of Infant Island when needed. That kind of messianic flavor is added in the filmmaking process.
Fans of the film will also find a much more politically minded version of the story here. In order to make the film more appealing to a mass market, it was given a lighter, more comedic tone, and the political allegory was greatly reduced.
Each of the authors brought their own particular kind of interest to the story. Another one of the writers, the writer of the third section, Hotta Yoshie, was a deeply, deeply politically involved writer. He was really interested in Japan's role on the world stage and thinking about how Japan should align itself during the Cold War, where Japan was in the 1960s and how it should ally itself with the rest of the world. Hotta was a big believer in the non-alignment movement. After World War II, basically the Cold War broke the world into two camps. There were some groups that followed the United States as one of the superpowers, and the other group followed the USSR as one of the great superpowers. And so Japan, placed itself firmly in the camp of the United States. It was placed under American military protection, but Hotta believed that actually Japan should not be aligning itself with either of the two superpowers, that actually Japan had a lot more in common with the other newly decolonizing nations of Africa, Pacific, and Asia. And so that's basically the whole reason that we get this subplot. In the story, Mothra comes from Infant Island, this new kind of decolonizing place out in the Pacific that's trying to get rid of its colonial masters. And so the whole story about Mothra is about how the Japanese scientists benefit from, identifying and helping out the people of Infant Island. Ultimately, by helping the people of Infant Island, Japan helps itself and helps the entire world. He works into the story. Hotta works into the story this idea of Japan perhaps should be going along with the decolonizing nations of the world rather than the great superpowers. So there was this kind of interesting political thing that was introduced here because of his involvement. I think that he was probably the main force in driving that kind of political subtext of the novella. A lot of this kind of very political subtext, it's very strong in the novella, but it kind of gets whitewashed out in the movie a little bit.
Of course, at the end of the day, what's exciting about the release of this novella is that, while Japanese fans, and kaiju fans who speak Japanese, have been privy to this information for decades, English speakers finally have the chance to read for themselves the purest form of a story that its three authors couldn't have guessed would have ripple effects across Japanese culture and the kaiju genre, by creating one of its most iconic monsters.
I think one of the great appeals of Mothra has to do with just how strange and unusual she is as a monster. I mean, I can't think of any other monsters that are so lovely, for lack of a better word. Yes, we have lots of other movies about gigantic ants, grasshoppers and so on, movies like that were made in the States, in the 1950s and 1960s. But there's a kind of, beauty and elegance to Mothra that I think really makes her appealing as a character. It does seem that when the writers were thinking about creating a monster, that they wanted to create something that was different than the gigantic monsters that they had seen in Western film. It seems like the creators of Mothra really wanted to do something that was different than that. Wanted to create a monster that was based in an image that would appeal and speak to the Japanese and feel different than the sort of Western kaiju that were already beginning to appear on screen. It's a little bit unclear exactly what kind of moth the writers imagined Mothra to be. In the 1961 version of the film, we see that Mothra is a very big, colorful, spotted moth with big dots and colors on the wings. But in the Japanese original text, it's not clear exactly what Mothra looks like. There have been people that have said that probably the authors imagined something closer to a silkworm, like the kind of moth that a silkworm produces, which is more whitish. The silkworms and silkworm moths have a deep connection to Japanese culture. Lots of Japanese people felt very close to them because silk production was one of the things that Japan did to make money. So there's a way in which the creators of Mothra might have been trying to create something that was a little bit different than the Western monsters. But they definitely succeeded. Even if Mothra didn't end up looking like a silkworm moth in the end, they created a monster that looks so different than any other monster that I think that people can't help falling in love with.
What's been covered here is but a taste of what you can expect to learn when reading The Luminous Fairies of Mothra. For Western fans of kaiju and Japanese culture, this is an exciting opportunity to expand your knowledge and understanding of one of the most beautiful monsters ever conceived, and the historical significance of her creation.
I think that when readers sit down and read this for the first time, people are going to be surprised at how different the novella is from the film. I mean, there's a lot of changes. Plot lines are developed that aren't in the original novella. Certain plot lines that are in the novella are dropped. And so, things move in a rather different pace in the book. It does a really, really good job of setting up the story, creating a creation myth for Infant Island and Mothra and the creature itself. Not as much detail on the destruction scenes are there in the novella. Although I think some readers might find that like a little bit disappointing, that they want to see Mothra destroy things. You might not get as much of that as you get in the film, but you do get something else. You do get a lot of background. You do get a deeper, richer story. And so I think that those differences can be a huge amount of fun. That's why I enjoyed working on this so much, thinking about all those differences and why they might be there. The time in which Mothra was created, the novella and then the film, was a really important time in Japanese history, when Japan was trying to figure out its role on the world stage. Who are we as a Japanese people? Who should we follow? Which ideologies should we go along with? And all of these kind of big questions about who are we, where are we going, are embedded right there in the novella. They become a little bit less clear when we watch the film version, but they're still there in a kind of latent, modified form. I really was excited to realize how tightly tied this book is to the kind of ideological and cultural struggles that Japan was going through at the moment.
I want to thank the University of Minnesota Press for this opportunity, and Jeffrey Angles for lending me his valuable time. Happy reading, and as always, long live the Queen.